You know, I've done a couple of things about Andy over the years, but usually a couple of little specific things. A question about this or a question about that. Hello. And I said, you know what? I haven't really talked about him for a very, very, very long time. Why not? Because actually, the stories I have, I'm happy to pass them on because people won't get to experience that. I became interested in pop culture very early on. Music was sort of top of my list at the time, but then art and cinema were also right there. I suppose the interesting thing the first time that I visited the factory was it was right out of the movies. There was paintings all over the floors and things propped up everywhere, and Andy keeping himself busy with the factory workers. You know, I was very familiar with what he had created and the influence that he'd had with not just the artworks, but with the films and the impact he'd had on culture. So it was really strange to walk into that environment as kids, but at the same time, it was exhilarating. This was one of our superheroes. I don't really know how Andy chose his friends. I met him because I had actually requested possibly meeting him and going to the factory. I'd never done that in my life. Being a kid, I thought, wow, if I've got the opportunity, that would be great. But as soon as I met him, I got on with him really, really well. And he said, why don't you come out tonight? And that was it. Then every time I was in New York, I didn't really know anyone else. At that time, my telephone book probably looked something like Mom and Dad, John, Uncle Bob, Andy Warhol. Because that was who we knew in New York. But he was the greatest person to know because, of course, he knew everyone. He introduced me to all these amazing people that became lifetime friends. People like Debbie Harry, for example, who I think is one of the most underrated musical artists of her generation. In that specific period, New York was really where everything was happening. It was palpable. It was as if it were on fire. You touched something and it was hot. And it was like that with art, particularly because all the really great artists were coming out of there at that time. And Andy, of course, was the godfather of these artists. He really fostered Jean-Michel and Keith Haring. It's very hard to describe, but it was quite a small scene, as things usually are. And the people around it all knew each other and hung out a lot together and exchanged ideas and had a lot of fun. I used to laugh with Andy almost every time I saw him because his perspective on things, the way he looked at life and the way he looked at people, he didn't miss anything. I think Andy was just a curious person. He was curious about life, and that's why his work has stood up perhaps more so than some of the other artists from the same period who weren't quite as curious. He wanted life, people. When we'd go out to dinner, it was rarely 2 or 3 people, it was usually 10 people. He liked conversation, he liked to understand what young people were doing. It was always designers and artists and photographers. He'd be the first to say to everyone when you go out, oh God, has anyone got any ideas for me today? And he was half joking, but of course someone would say something, and sure enough, the next day you'd find him drawing this thing or printing something to see if he could make it work. The most I ever learned from him was the way to approach something, because I think he really took a broad vision and he understood what was coming in the future. If there were robotics coming, he wanted to play with them. If there was a new video camera that came out, he was the first to use. He knew that ideas came from all over the place, and it's capturing them and turning it into something that is the real skill and the genius that he had. I'm very grateful to have known him for the years that I did until he passed away, because I learned a lot from the way that he dealt with people and the way that he dealt with his creativity generally. I think with the passage of time, as you look back at the people that you've known in life and the people that perhaps significant to you in some way, you are able to get a very different perspective. The one thing that I think Andy left with everybody was a vision for the future. He made the blueprint of what was to come for reality TV, for understanding fame like nobody else, for reproduction and mechanically made screen prints, and for his attitude to life. Wow, the only thing that I'm super sad about is that Andy wasn't around to see what happened. The internet, there is nobody that would have loved the internet more than Andy. Reality TV, it was all his dreams come true. I think he would have been sick of it by now though. I have a sadness that we never worked with Andy on a project specifically. It would have been great. He wanted to do a video, he wanted to do portraits, and I wish they existed. But at the same time, I'm so grateful that I got to know him and that we spent time together. In the time capsules, when they opened them, they kept finding Duran stuff that he put in there. So I guess a little bit of us is always going to be with Andy.